Hi, my name is Michelle. I work at the Heart Institute at Cincinnati Children's and wear many different hats, including Senior Clinical Research Coordinator, Project Manager, and Manager. Cincinnati Children's is a clinical site within the Pediatric Heart Network. The PHN was established in 2001 by the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute to support clinical research in pediatric cardiovascular disease. It's comprised of 10 core sites, auxiliary sites, a data coordinating center, and guided by NHLBI program staff. When I started at Cincinnati Children's, I was tasked with leading the coordinating efforts for one of the studies our site was participating in. Over time, I became more and more involved with the network and developed a passion for cultivating relationships that foster optimal recruitment and retention so that we can improve health outcomes, disseminate findings, train and educate new researchers, and provide support and advocacy for families through the conduct of clinical research. Since 2011, I have served as the chair of the PHN Study Coordinator Committee. In this role, I helped create guidance for recruitment, retention, and adherence, and have served on various protocol development committees. With the implementation of the revised Common Rule, I helped the network establish a single IRB infrastructure housed at Cincinnati Children's and oversee SIRB operations. I was invited to represent the pediatric perspective of inclusion across the lifespan as it pertains to recruitment, enrollment, and retention because of the front row seat I have been afforded in my role with the PHN as the network strives to sustain the collaboration, ensure study feasibility, overcome regulatory hurdles, and successfully recruit and retain study participants. My objective for this presentation is to share practical advice that's evidence-based on how to optimize recruitment and retention in underrepresented populations. I want to start by addressing some of the barriers we face in conducting clinical research. And I want to highlight a story about a research participant that spoke at a webinar that I attended earlier this year. The woman spoke of her experience as a participant in an immunotherapy clinical trial. She's an educated, white journalist used to asking questions and pressing for answers. She lives in a major metropolitan area, has good health insurance, and easy access to some of the top medical care. Her job affords her a flexible work schedule, and she has a vast web of social support. Despite all of those advantages, she said being a cancer patient was one of the scariest and most traumatizing experiences of her life. And when she was handed a 27-page consent document, it was overwhelming, as you can imagine. You and I know that very few people are afforded the opportunity to be able to walk into that type of situation with the resources and options that she had. But despite all of the things that were working in her favor, she still struggled. The bottom line is, regardless of our background and resources, we all deserve excellent care, and we each have the responsibility to take steps, big and small, to minimize and eliminate barriers that stand in the way of equal access and care. This woman is now a cancer survivor and advocating to make clinical research more accessible and collaborative. She wants the world to know that study participants are not passive vessels. They have a voice and something to offer the research community. I think it's important that we remember this message. So what are the barriers that we face when trying to increase participation in underrepresented populations? A population that's comprised of young and old, racial and ethnic minorities, sex and gender minorities, people with disabilities and comorbidities, rural and isolated populations, and language minority individuals. Some individuals in these situations have difficulty trusting the healthcare system. They may lack reliable transportation, live far away from healthcare facilities. Some of them may not read, may not speak or understand English, may not have insurance, could be undocumented, and many of them are just busy with living their lives, working, attending school, and caring for children and other family members. We're all well-versed in the challenges that we face in enrolling a truly diverse and representative sample in clinical trials. The persistent lack of diversity in clinical trials means that many therapies are never tested on the very patients they're intended to serve. So what can we do to make sure the study populations better reflect patient populations? That data being generated will be as generalizable as possible. The remainder of my presentation is going to focus on lessons I've learned over the years in ways I've worked to overcome some of these barriers. The more we share practical, evidence-based advice, the closer we will come to achieving our goal of truly representative research. Before we get into more of the practical ways we can increase representation in clinical trials, I think it's important that we pause and consider some key points. First, we need to remember that when we speak of diversity, we're speaking about more than age, race, and ethnicity. We need to think of the other underrepresented populations that I previously mentioned. To increase participation and diversity, we need to understand the importance of trust and communication and fostering relationships that facilitate inclusion and participation. We need to begin with an intentional goal of successful and inclusive participation in mind. We can't do it alone. We must take the time that it takes to cultivate a team and network of collaborators who can help create an environment that's supportive of participation. We must seek input from experts in the field, providers, patients, and their caregivers. We need to have conversations with people who have various perspectives to understand what particular barriers a trial might face and work to address those barriers as we develop the protocols and not wait until those barriers pop up in our face and are getting in our way of execution. We need to think about compensation in the context of caregivers as well. When your study population includes children as well as older adults, it's important to consider the family unit that they're a part of. We should not fail to consider the caregivers that accompany these participants when we're compensating for time and effort. What are we doing to make participation feasible from the caregiver's perspective as well? Are we accounting for time away from work? There are other caregiving responsibilities and the like. We need to make sure that we're looking at the whole picture and providing logistical support. We also need to consider that sometimes there's unintended consequences to participation in research. Will standard of care costs be reimbursed if a patient's enrolled in a clinical study? Will compensation be taxed? Will compensation potentially disqualify a participant from Medicaid or another benefit? Will a participant be asked to provide their Social Security number or a tax ID in order to receive compensation? What if he or she doesn't have one? Questions and concerns like these could be factors for some participants as they're deciding whether or not to participate. We need to be conscientious and understanding in resolving these types of uncertainties. I like this 5T model in thinking about how to best increase participation and diversity. First, we need to consider who is our target population and what underrepresented populations within that do we need to be intentional about accommodating. What are the needs of the patient population? Where are we going to find them? How will we reach them? And how will we communicate with them? Next, who should have a seat at the table as we design the study? The broader the team, the more representative the perspectives, and the better the design and execution. Study teams should include not just physicians and scientists, but also study coordinators who have boots on the ground experience, statisticians, data managers, maybe even referring clinicians or physicians that are seeing these patients, the patients themselves and their caregivers, and also consider the patient advocacy groups. Keep in mind that the diversity within the team will foster diversity within the study population. We also need to ensure we account for the time it takes to develop a well thought out protocol and navigate the complicated review and contracting process. Once the study is set up and running, we also need to account for the time it takes to find and reach the patient population and establish that relationship. We need to account for the time it takes to develop relationships with the participants, their caregivers, as well as their clinical providers. Will the study team be looking for the proverbial needle in a haystack? Once you find a potentially eligible patient, how many no's will you get before you get a yes? What's that consent rate going to be like? Once you have a participant recruited and enrolled, how much time do you need before, during, and after each study encounter? These things always take more time than we think they will take, just like studies are always more expensive than we think they will be. But we'll get to that when we talk about tools. Next, we need to consider what steps we can take to accommodate the participant throughout the lifetime of the study. How many visits are required? Are that many visits really required? Now more than ever, we also need to think about what study activities can be done remotely. We need to be scrupulous in our review of study feasibility and consider innovative approaches to study encounters. We need to be ever mindful of ways that we can make research more accessible and accommodating to families. Can visits be conducted outside of normal business hours? Can we do evenings or weekend study visits? Can we take research to where the participants are? Can we go to their homes, their schools, or their places of work? Finally, we need to consider the tools necessary to execute the study. Importantly, this does include the study budget, but don't just think about the budget in terms of effort and procedural cost. You need to think about the budget so that we're able to foster the participation and include reimbursement, compensation, and incentives. Think about tools that can supplement our budget or resources that could supplement the budget and tools in terms of communication, patient-facing materials, advertising. And advertising doesn't always have to cost money. It could be social media and patient advocacy groups and follow-up materials. Also, I believe in sharing resources. We're all stretched for time and money. So let's do more to share what we have so that we're not reinventing the wheel time and time again. We need to create forums to share the tools and resources that we've already developed. Earlier, I mentioned that part of my role within the PHN is to serve as the study committee or study coordinator committee chair. One of those things I did in that committee was to develop a guidance for different study chairs as they're working to develop a protocol. And it's intended to be a plan that encompasses recruitment, enrollment, adherence, and retention. The first step in that plan is to analyze our target population, and you're going to notice a lot of overlap with that 5T model. We need to figure out who the patient population is and what are the barriers or special needs that that patient population may have. Then we need to establish our team of collaborators and stakeholders. Make sure that everyone at the table can contribute a different perspective. You have your principal investigators, your study coordinators, clinicians, patient advocacy groups, participants, and caregivers. Next, it's time to start detailing what that plan is going to look like from the beginning, from patient identification to recruitment, enrollment. Each study visit should be outlined. You need to look at your overall goals and benchmarks for the study and how you're going to meet them. Plan out your study roles and responsibilities. If you're asking that each study encounter include a physical exam, who's going to conduct that exam? Is it feasible or realistic to expect the study investigator or sub-investigator to be at each of those encounters? What if the study visit is done outside of their typical clinic? What if it's done at a separate location? You need to look at it and walk through the steps as you go. And again, go back to that budget and make sure that you're covered, not just from the procedural costs, but also that you can bring these patients in and make sure that they're reimbursed for their times and troubles. What methods will you use for recruitment? Is it going to be brochures, newsletters, advertising? Are you going to have flyers available in the clinic? Look at all those materials that are likely to be successful. And then go into the next step, which is looking at retention and adherence. If you're looking at an interventional study, how are you going to measure that study intervention is being done? And if you can't know if it's effective, if it's not being effectively done. Look at detail a plan for compensation, incentives, and reimbursements. And within the network, there's many sites that we have enrolling. So we understand that there's going to be variation from center to center. The plan should be flexible enough to accommodate that local variability. And make sure that you're including from the beginning a plan to disseminate your results. Being able to show these participants what the return on investment is sometimes one of the few advantages or benefits that we can give, to show them how they contributed to the progress of the disease that they're participating in, or if it's a healthy study, how their data is helping to generalize and advance care for others. Once you think you have a pretty comprehensive and robust plan, it's time to go back to the stakeholders and have them vet that plan. And it should be described once you're in agreement. describe that plan, generally speaking, within the protocol or manual of operations. And again, make sure that you're allowing for variation by site as appropriate. Then you submit it for approval. And once you're ready to go ahead and implement. And then it's important to stop at regular intervals and evaluate how it's going. And from there, you just refine and revise. And I do believe in the power of harnessing collaborative learning. Use resources, whether they be in your department, in your institution, or with other sites that you're working with, to share what is working and what can be adapted. I want to spend the rest of my time with you looking at some real world examples and lessons learned. Looking at one study as our starting point, the Marfan trial experience. This was a study that was a randomized controlled trial. It was comparing atenolol versus losartan in a little over 600 children and young adults with Marfan syndrome at 21 different centers across the United States, Canada, and Europe. Some of the barriers that we faced, we planned the study duration to be 3 years for patient accrual. It ended up taking 4. Some of the barriers that slowed us down a little were that we were working with a rare disease. Within that rare disease, there was restrictive eligibility criteria. So you take a small pool of patients and then you apply the restrictive entry eligibility criteria, and it gets whittled down to be even smaller. The age range for the study was 6 months to 24 years, and it involved a complex study and medication regimen and a 3-year time commitment. The study activities included 5 in-person visits, echocardiograms, anthropometric measurements. There was ECG monitoring for 24 hours at each encounter, and while the medication was being up titrated, and we had regular phone call contact with those patients to see how they were doing. The age range being as wide as it was, from 6 months to 24 years, seems like it could be an advantage that you had a wider pool, but it also had challenges in that these patients were seen oftentimes at different locations. It might be at a pediatric institution with pediatric providers, or it could be an adult provider. And it also meant that we had to be flexible and nimble in our approaches to enroll a participant with a family of a 6-month-old versus a 22-year-old who is off at college and trying to establish themselves in the real world with new jobs and things like that. There were a lot of competing priorities, and we had to be flexible. After the study was over, we looked at overall recruitment, retention, and adherence, the study measures. We looked for predictors of adherence across things like site, age, race, medical history, and things like that. And then we surveyed the sites that were enrolling and asked them about the strategies they used and resources available to them. Some of the things that we learned, that recruitment and retention goals can be met with good adherence. We saw that the recruiting site and age were associated with all measures of adherence. Specifically, we also learned that younger adults and African American participants had lower level of adherence. Things that fostered good adherence throughout the study was employing multiple strategies, investing in resources that were available to you, whether it be personnel or material, using as many strategies as you had, working hard to minimize staff turnover, because the rapport that you build with the participants really helped with recruitment and retention over time. And that it was important to maximize collaboration with referring providers, with families, with other sites, and the patient advocacy group that we worked with, the Marfan Foundation, provided unmeasurable support. They promoted the study through their use of newsletters, emails on their website. They had yearly conferences that were well attended, and they would invite the investigators and study teams there to do actual screenings and to talk to them about how enrollment was going, how the patients were doing. These patients also, at the beginning of the study, when we started to enroll, there was a lot of feeling that losartan was going to be a miracle drug for them. Early data suggested that there was going to be increased efficacy in controlling their aortic root enrollment or enlargement. And so we had to go in and explain to them why we were doing the study, that this was the next step to do a larger randomized control trial to truly see if there was a difference. And in the end, we found that both drugs were relatively equivalent. Providers sometimes thought that losartan might be better tolerated. And we were able to go back and say, well, actually, adverse events were relatively comparable between the two groups. So we found that communication was really important, that success takes time, communication and effort and money too. Fortunately, some of the support that we received from the Marfan Foundation was monetary as well. They had a dedicated staff that could help us work with arranging travel so that participants could come from remote locations. Our site in particular, we thought we had a pretty robust clinic that saw these patients, and that looking at the eligibility criteria, of course they would meet eligibility. But the reality is, once we got going, only, I think we said we had 50 patients that would meet eligibility requirements, and only 7 enrolled. So we had to get creative in terms of how we were going to reach more and go outside of our typical catchment area. And we had to foster those relationships with outside referring physicians and work with the Marfan Foundation to bring participants in from out of state. We had participants from Michigan, from Kentucky, Indiana, Tennessee, Georgia, and Mississippi. The Marfan Foundation was able to work with Mercy Medical Airlift and provide airlift services for a patient that lived in a rural, remote area, so that the girl and her mom could come to each study visit. We also saw that differences in age and race meant that we had to strategize accordingly. We had to have materials ready for the youngest of patients as well as the oldest of patients. We had to be more flexible with study visits and finding ways and scheduling visits during summer months for those who were in school or in college. And that one of the biggest keys to success was sharing our learnings. So we had monthly conference calls with all of the site PIs and coordinators and the project team at the DCC and NHLBI. And we looked at those sites that were doing well with their enrollment, and we asked them what they were doing, what tools they were using, and we created a platform to where those could be shared. We looked early, well, I'd say later than we should have. We looked at adherence to the study medication. And the only way you can assess their adherence is by counting residual. This was how we were doing it. And we realized that we weren't getting back as many of the pill bottles as we thought we would. So it was harder to measure adherence. So we had kind of an intervention and looked at sites who were getting back essentially all of the pill bottles that they administered and asked them what they were doing. Some of them were providing small incentive, $5 a bottle for each one that was returned. Some of them were providing prepaid mailers for them to send it back in. And the sites that had lower adherence and bottle return rates were able to employ strategies that were able to increase overall return rate. And going back and looking at the data, that intervention was successful, and we had a significant difference in that. And again, going back to the patient advocacy group, asking how can you support us, explaining the mission, and these advocacy groups are where the patients are, and they already have that trust and communication set up. So it was pivotal for us to partner with them. I could go on with other examples and how we took those lessons learned and employed them into other studies moving forward. We do look a lot in terms of the number of visits and seeing what we can do to minimize that as much as possible to ease the burden of travel, supplementing with mileage reimbursement. For one study, we worked with an industry partner, and they were able to give us a bucket of money that we could use to supplement travel to have the participants getting to the site. And we had a family that was eligible and willing and interested in participating, but they lived about 2 hours from the study center. They were willing to drive, but the problem was they did not have a car. So we had to find a way to get them to the center. We looked at renting a car or having them rent a car and come to us, which they said they would do. So we called Enterprise to pick them up, and surprisingly, Enterprise wouldn't even go out that far to get to them. So we had our work cut out, but we were able to work with the family. Took a lot of time, but we were able to get them here for the necessary study visits. Um, Also realizing that young adults sometimes have um, unique struggles, we try to strategize um, timing of visits. So starting a study in the summer months where they might be on break from school, high school, or college and home and have an easier time coming in. We had a study that was a phase 1 study that required them to come in um, several times within 5 days. And it was hard to manage that time within the clinic. So what we did is worked with our clinical labs and basically blocked out time in advance. And we said we would like to schedule, because we knew if we didn't get enrollment off the ground in the summer, that these families wouldn't be willing to come and spend days with us during the school year and miss that much school and work. So we were able to block visits to enroll one participant a week for 3 weeks in the summer. And that was very successful for us. But it took a lot of collaboration with other systems within the hospital to make it happen. We also supported the enrollment of this patient population that was mostly young adult with iPads to help program visit reminders, medication reminders, and things like that. And it also was a nice incentive for this group as well. So I could go on for hours talking about ways to overcome these barriers. It takes creativity, it takes innovation, it takes going the extra mile, and it's all worth it. So I thank you for your time. I encourage you to submit any questions or comments that you have in advance of the workshop on September 2nd. We will look through those and do our best to address them and be ready to talk about them on the call, on the live webinar when that takes place in September. If you don't want to submit them in advance, you'll have an opportunity to submit them in a chat box during the live workshop. And we really look forward to speaking with you in a robust discussion. Thank you for your time.